So now, without further ado, we will begin. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're glad you're here. I'm Eric White, the Adult Services Librarian here at the Estes Valley Library. As you may know, the theme of this year's summer reading program is Wander the World. So in our programming, we're bringing you stories and experiences from around the globe. This evening, I'm thrilled to welcome Marjan Kamali to discuss her book, The Stationery Shop, a story of love, loss, reconciliation, and the twists and turns of fate set against the political upheaval of 1953 Tehran. A little bit about Marjan. She is the award-winning author of The Stationery Shop, a national bestseller, and Together Tea, a Massachusetts Book Award finalist. She is a 2022 recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship. Marjan's novels are published in translation in more than 20 languages. Her essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Literary Hub, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Marjan holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of California, Berkeley, a Master of Business Administration from Columbia University, and a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from New York University. Born in Turkey to Iranian parents, Kamali spent her childhood in Turkey, Iran, Germany, Kenya, and the US. She currently teaches creative writing at Grub Street and lives in the Boston area with her family. Please welcome Marjan Kamali.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that lovely intro. It's an honor to join all of you here for the Estes Valley Library's Wander the World program. I'm really excited to share with you tonight a little bit about the story behind the story of The Stationery Shop, and to talk to you about my writing process, the background and the influences that helped bring this book to fruition, and also to share with you some tips I have for maintaining joy and stamina in any kind of practice. I think doing any kind of artistic activity requires discipline, but a lot of times we forget that it also should be joyful. So thank you for sharing your time with me tonight. Let me tell you first a little bit about my own background. So as Eric mentioned, I grew up moving a lot. I've lived in 7 countries and 5 continents. And I think because I moved so much when I was growing up, I was able to get a sense of perspective about how different we are, and also basically how we're all the same. So yes, I was born in Turkey. I lived in Iran, Germany, Kenya, the US, and later in my young adulthood, I lived in Switzerland and Australia. But no matter where I've been, no matter which culture I've been immersed in, one thing I've noticed is that even though our outfits or our language or our political systems, our customs may be different, human dynamics are the same the world over. So when I moved from post-revolutionary, war-torn Iran to Forest Hills, Queens, New York City, when I was almost 11, in the middle of 5th grade, most of my teachers, God bless their hearts, they were very, very kind and concerned, and they kept asking me, how are you doing with the culture shock? It must be so, so different. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that things weren't really that different in Iran versus the US. Yes, we were in a war, and thankfully we weren't in New York City, but in the school playground, there was still the queen bee, and there was still the teacher's pet in the classroom, and there was still the mean girl and all of that. So basically human dynamics were the same wherever I went, whether it was Kenya, Iran, Germany. And I think because I was immersed in these different cultures at a young age, I had good training to be a writer. And it showed me that the human condition itself is so very universal. The other thing that I think really influenced me as a child and made me want to become a writer is that I read a lot. I read so much. I read to escape. This was before the internet. This was before kids could be fused to their phones. But those of us who were bookworms were often told the same things that we now tell kids who are fused to their phones. We were told to look up. We were told to stop hunching. We were told that it could ruin our eyesight. We were told to be present. But I was always appreciative of the words of authors, not just because they could transport me to a different time and place, but because I really think that the words of authors saved me. So a part of my childhood that was very formative was the year and a half I spent in Iran during the war. And during wartime, air sirens would go off, and in the middle of the night, we'd go down to the basement. And in that basement, my mother, in order to make us feel comfortable, had stocked it, with books and board games and playing cards. And we tried to keep ourselves busy so as not to get distracted by the bombs outside. But one thing that saved me was reading. And I remember thinking that those authors, by just stringing together small letters of the alphabet onto a page, were able to transport me and create magic. And I remember thinking, if ever I am able to do that for others, I would like to do that. And that's when the cake was baked. That's when the seed was first planted in that basement when I was 10 years old. But once my family moved to the United States, like the families of so many immigrants from so many different countries, the priority was to gain a sense of stability, financial security, and establish ourselves. And lo and behold, apparently being a writer doesn't help you do those things. So I did all the things good immigrant girls do. I pretended to be pre-med for a little bit, didn't work out. I applied to law school, but in my personal statement, I stated that I would like to be a creative writer, so they were on to me. And I went through many, many, many different iterations and a very zigzaggy path until finally I was able to sort of admit that what I wanted to do as a vocation was be a writer. And that's when I, in the middle of getting an MBA, also applied to get a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. And there were a couple of years there where I was doing both in tandem, going uptown to, Columbia Business School in Manhattan, and then doing like a little switcheroo, and then going downtown to the NYU MFA program and commuting from New Jersey. And everybody said, you're crazy to do this. And I thought, well, I felt I owed it to the people, the friends I left behind in Iran to make something of myself. And I was very determined to do so. And then I got pregnant and had another baby. And let's just say that all the writing, all the ambition, everything was put aside for several years when my life was made up of playgrounds, play dates, play groups. And it wasn't until my youngest went to kindergarten that I was able to return to writing. So I'm what you might call a late bloomer, though I had the passion early on, I had the desire early on, and I was writing early on. My first novel got published when I was 42, and it's called Together Tea. And I will show it to you because here we are in my home office where I write most of these books. So here's Together Tea, and it got, to my shock, great reviews and accolades, and I couldn't believe it. And then it got translated into several languages, and I rode that wave until people kept saying, well, what's the next book? And then that's when I realized, oh, I have to do this again. Okie dokie. So let me tell you a little bit about the story that inspired the Stationery Shop, because here I was, I had written Together Tea, and I was doing book club visits for it. And at the end of a book club visit, one of the women came up to me and asked if I would go where she works. And she said she worked at an assisted living center, and she wanted me to read for the residents there. So I said, sure. And I went down to the Duxbury Senior Center, read from the book, and there was an elderly gentleman in a wheelchair who kept saying all these things. And later on, they had organized this lovely lunch. We sat down to lunch. He wheeled himself over to me. He continued to say all these things, and here's what he was saying. He was saying, did you know I met the Prince of Spain? Did you know I traveled with Charles de Gaulle? And everybody kind of, shushed him, and I didn't know what to make of it. I just asked him his name. And later, when I was chatting with my own father about the book events that I was doing, and he asked how things were going, I mentioned this man because he had an Iranian name. And my father thinks he knows every Iranian American of a certain age. And when I said this man's name, my father said, oh, he was one of our most decorated dignitaries. He met the Prince of Spain. He traveled with Charles de Gaulle. And I remember sitting there thinking, first of all, I was embarrassed that I personally hadn't believed him, but also thinking, what does it mean to be in this assisted living center with this past that nobody believes? Or maybe they believe it, maybe they did believe it, but they didn't really care. And that became the seed for the Stationery Shop. So I started to write about an elderly gentleman sitting in a wheelchair in an assisted living center. I cleverly disguised the name. I called it the Duxton Center as opposed to Duxbury. And as I wrote that first draft, and I will share with you in a little bit how I do the first draft, but as I wrote that first draft, I realized this is going to be a love story. Obviously, it's not that gentleman's life, who has since sadly passed away. He just kind of gave me the inspiration. And then the story unfolded into this love story. And, the Stationery Shop, I would say, is at its core about lost love. A lot of people think it's about first love. Well, it is. But to me, what's more important is that that first love was lost. And so the Stationery Shop takes place in 2013 when Roya first enters this assisted living center to see again for the first time in 60 years, that first love whom she had first met when she was 17 back in 1953 in Iran. And Roya, our heroine, and Bahman meet in a stationery shop when they're 17 in 1953 Iran, and they fall madly in love in this kind of whirlwind way that I think usually only happens when one is very young. And they're all set to get married. But then on the day that they're supposed to get their marriage certificate, the country erupts into a violent coup d'etat. And Roya is not able to meet Bahman at the square where they had planned to meet. And she looks for him in vain for days. And let's just say, I don't want to give too much away, but letters are exchanged and Roya ends up brokenhearted, absolutely brokenhearted, resigns herself to a life without him, without that love, and moves to America and goes to college and eventually meets Walter and gets married and has a child and moves on, or does she? Because this first love haunts her for decades. And it's not until 60 years later that through a twist of fate. Again, no spoilers for those of you who haven't yet read The Stationery Shop. But through what I've been told is a very moving situation, she is able to find again Bahman, this first love of hers, and go to meet him and ask him why he left her there, why he never showed up, and get the closure that so many of us don't get. So what I'd like to do before I go into the writing process and how I do the writing of these books is first just give you a little flavor of The Stationery Shop. So I'm going to read for you just a short bit. I get it. We're on screens. Attention spans aren't the best. So don't worry. I'm not going to go on too long. But this is from the very beginning, because that way I don't have to say much, though I've already said quite a bit. But let's say when you pick this up at the library, at the Estes Public Library, the Estes Valley Library, just open it. Chapter 1, 2013, The Center. Dive right in. I made an appointment to see him. She said it as if she were seeing the dentist or a therapist or the pushy refrigerator salesman who had promised her and Walter a lifetime guarantee of cold milk and crisp vegetables and unspoiled cheese if only they would buy this brand new model. Walter dried the dishes, his gaze on the kitchen towel and its print of a yellow chick holding an umbrella. He didn't argue. Walter Archer's penchant for logic, his ability to let reason trump all, was a testament to Roya's own good judgment. For hadn't she married a man who was reasonable and, my goodness, unbelievably understanding? Hadn't she, in the end, not married that boy, the one she had met so many decades ago in a small stationery shop in Tehran, but lassoed her life instead to this Massachusetts-born pillar of stability, this Walter, who ate a hard-boiled egg for breakfast almost every single day, who said as he dried the dishes, "If you want to see him, then you should. You've been a bit of a wreck, I'm afraid." By now, Roya Archer was almost American, not just by marriage, but by virtue of having been in these United States for over 5 decades. She could remember a childhood spent in the hot and dusty streets of Tehran, playing tag with her little sister Zari, but her life now was carefully enclosed in New England with Walter. One visit to one shop a mere week ago to buy paper clips had cracked everything open. Once again, she was mired in 1953. Cinema Metropole in the middle of Iran's largest city that contentious summer. The red circular sofa in the lobby over which a chandelier's crystals glistened like tears. Smoke from cigarettes floated in wisps. Up the stairs and into the movie theater he had led her, and there on the screen, stars with foreign names caressed each other. After the film, he had walked with her in the summer twilight. The sky was lavender and layered with shades of purple, so varied they seemed impossible. He had asked her to marry him near the jasmine soap bushes. His voice cracked when he said her name. They had exchanged countless love letters, planned their union, but in the end, nothing. Life had pulled out from under her everything that they had planned. No worries. Roya's mother had always said that our fate is written on our foreheads when we're born. It can't be seen, can't be read, but it's there in invisible ink, all right, and life follows that fate, no matter what. She had squished that boy out of her mind for decades. She had a life to build, a country to get to know, Walter, a child to raise. That Tehran boy could very well be squeezed to the absolute bottom of the bucket like a rag, useless and worn out, and pressed so far down into the depths that after a while he was almost forgotten. But now she could finally ask him why he had left her there. in the middle of the square. And so that's the opening of the stationery shop. Roya, at age 77, gets to go to this assisted living center, see the boy whom she fell in love with when she was 17, to whom she was engaged, and speak to him again. But of course, then we go back in time. We go back in time to see how they met and to see how they fell in love, to see what the country was like during that time. And we follow their lives over the course of 6 decades, during which they were not together. So that's just a little taste of the stationery shop. And now I would like to share with you a little bit about my writing process, because I know that was promised. So having written a book called The Stationery Shop, you may be not surprised to know that I love stationery. And like many authors, I do a lot of my first draft in longhand using a pen. Remember those? I think sometimes people are surprised to hear that authors write parts of their drafts in longhand, but I'm definitely not alone. I like to keep things simple. I have a notebook for each book. So here's the literal notebook for the stationery shop. And in it are all kinds of things, everything from literal, parts of the book that I wrote in it, to places where, for example, my father, in his attempt to help me understand the layout of Tehran's geography in 1953, he drew me a map of where the square would have been, where they met. And he was very adamant that I get everything geographically correct. So at the time I said, oh, Dad, no one's going to care if it's geographically correct. But when this book went to copy editing at Simon & Schuster, the copy editor would come back to me and say things like, oh, you said Hafez Street. It was actually Hafez Avenue. So you'll be happy to know it's all geographically correct. And in here, I do all kinds of things, a lot of character work, delving deep, writing journal entries from the viewpoint of the characters. I have, even if those entries never end up in the book, it just helps me as the writer to understand who these people are. And I hope that deep understanding is then reflected in the book that you end up reading. And then I have a separate notebook. This is for the scenes that are uber emotional. Those of you who've read The Stationery Shop know there's quite a few of those. Some crying in this book. There's some healing, catharsis, sadness too, crying. And then I really needed a separate notebook for those scenes because I don't know, I just really delve deep. So those are here. Now, people write to me all the time. They say, I cried so much. Oh my God, I can't stop thinking about them, my tissues. Well, guess what? Every time the reader cries, you can guarantee I cried writing it. So there were a lot of tears during the course of writing this book. This book then struck a chord, thank goodness. I'm grateful for that. And it's been translated so far. The Stationery Shop has been translated into 19 languages. And some of the foreign editions are super beautiful, and they all get to choose their own titles. So I want to share with you some of the different foreign editions because I get such a kick out of how each country interprets a book. So here's the French edition, La Librairie de Tehran. It's doing pretty well in France. I think that's a lovely thing to see. People send me pictures of the book there. This is the book in Slovenia. Here's the Turkish version. I won't pretend to tell you what what all these titles are because some of them I don't know. I do. I have a spreadsheet, but I don't know it off the top of my head. Here we are in Norway. Here we are in Israel, Hebrew. Here we are in Iran, Persian. That's a long story, which I can share if you wish later. This is the complex Chinese version published in Taiwan, Romania, Bosnia, and then one of my favorite titles, The Scent of Saffron. The Scent of Saffron is what the Stationery Shop is called in Poland. That's just a taste. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just wanted to share those with you because they have different covers sometimes, and certainly they have different titles too. Okay, so let me see how I'm doing on time. One thing I did want to share with you, as promised, are 7 sort of things I think about to keep myself motivated, because I teach writing, and a lot of times my students will say, there's too much going on in the world, and it's making me incredibly anxious and sad. And therefore, I can't focus on my art. Therefore, I can't focus on my writing, my painting, my drawing, what have you. We all have different art forms. But I would like to quickly share with you these little tips because I think it might help the aspiring writers who are listening, or the aspiring artists, or those of you who just have a hard time even keeping up with your hobbies. Number 1 is to accept that it will never be a good time. It's not like it's necessarily going to get better. I hate to say this, but it's not like by waiting, it's going to get better. So great quote from Toni Morrison. I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it's important not to ignore its pain, it's also critical to refuse to succumb. And there's no place for self-pity, no room for fear. In times of dread, artists must never choose to remain silent. So if things are bad, all the more reason to keep writing, keep going with your art. Number 2 is to break everything down into chunks. So no book is ever written in one go. No chapter is ever written in one go. I would dare say no scene is. So just to really just dedicate, even if it's 15 minutes a day, dedicate 15 minutes a day to your art. And you could set a timer and then promise that once that timer goes off, you'll go do something else. But that's how books get written. The third one I already shared with you is to go longhand. I think a lot of writers waste so much time on the computer. I know this is controversial, but just booting it up takes 200 hours. Finding the document, just get a notebook, spiral notebook, CVS, and a pen. That's all you need, really. And number 4 is to make it fun. I think we mistake these kinds of endeavors with something terribly serious and awful, and it's a long slog, and okay, well, maybe your book is serious, but that doesn't mean you have to be. And I always say, take your work seriously, but not yourself. So enjoy it. It's an outlet. Number 5, this one I highly recommend, especially for women. Don't write for yourself. I think if we think it's something we're doing for ourselves, we tend not to do it, because a lot of people, and I'll say it, especially a lot of women, tend to forego what's for them. So don't think of it as something you're doing for yourself. Think of it as something you're doing for that one reader for whom you'll make a difference. Number 6 is take your writing seriously, because no one else will. So I did say don't take yourself seriously, but unless you take your art seriously, there's no one coming. There's no like magical person gonna come down and help you out. You have to do it. And unless you take it seriously, no one else will. And the last little tidbit I have for the aspiring artists who are listening is to remember we are the lucky ones. Whether you have the desire to write, whether you have the desire to do pottery, whether you have the desire to draw, to paint, to dance, we are the lucky ones because we have an outlet. And I think this came out really clearly during the pandemic. when a lot of people were tied up in knots, rightfully so, artists had an outlet, and that was helpful. And I'm not saying all artists were able to perhaps, do their art at the height of the lockdown and the height of the horrificness of the pandemic. But I do think that for people who had an art, they fared just a little bit better because they had that outlet. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to be super brave and do this and share my screen because I don't often do this during my book talks online, is I wanted to give all of you just a little bit more of a background about the history of the women's movement in Iran, because the Stationery Shop takes place in 1953. And so for this book, I did a ton of research, not just about the coup d'etat that happened in 1953, but about what was going on in that country then. So let's see if this works out. Here we go. Yeah, hopefully all of you can see that. Let's just see. Actually, let me try again. Okay, so this is an organization, a women's rights organization that started in Tehran, 1923 to 1933. I'm not going to go into too much detail during this talk because I want to have time for the Q&A, but I wanted to give everybody here a sense of how long this history has been in the making. So many of you may have been watching the news, hearing on the news, women's rights protests in Iran that started in September of 2022, women in the streets fighting for their rights. Well, it's a long time coming. So just want all of you to just get a sense of this history briefly, to get a sense of how different things were back in the 70s, the 60s, and the 70s, where before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the dress code was, well, non-existent. Women could choose to dress how they wished for the most part. And then this is a very famous photograph from Women's Day of March 1979. This is now after the 1979 revolution has taken place. It took place in February of that year. And there was a worry that women's rights were going to become eroded. There was a worry that there was going to become a universal countrywide dress code for women where hijab, instead of being by choice, would be mandated. And so women took to the streets. They took to the streets in the hopes of having this not happen. This is a very moving slide. These are men who held hands, encircled the women so that they could sort of protect them, because there were other men not so kind attacking these women for marching for these rights. And now, sadly, something that's become part of life in Iran over the past 44 years is what they call the so-called morality police, where women are stopped and they are fined, imprisoned for improper hijab. And there's been a long, long history of protests that have been squashed. This is a famous 1999 Economist cover, those student dorm protests that happened back in '99. They were squashed. There was the 2009 Green Movement crackdown. There were 2019 protests, crackdown. And then many of you may have heard of Mahsa Amini, who was arrested for improper hijab and died while in police custody. And she sparked this new set of protests with the slogan "Women, Life, Freedom." So I'm just, the reason I share that is because every book that you read is political, even the books that pretend they're not, because to be not political is also a political, I would argue, privilege. So I wanted to give some context to what's going on in Iran today, even though the Stationery Shop takes place for the most part in 1953 Iran. We do follow Roya through her life later, and I think it's impossible to wander the world and read about Iran without thinking about what's currently happening there. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much what I have. I'm happy to open it up to questions and hear what all of you have to say. Hi, Eric. Hello.
Hello. All right. So yeah, I just want to remind folks, feel free to just put your question in the chat and I will pick it up and put it to Marjan. Melanie asks, what books did you read as a child in war-torn Iran in the shelter?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Melanie, because my answer might surprise you. So I think I shared with all of you that I had grown up, my childhood, even up to that point, we were moving a ton. So my mom had a lot of English language books. And when we moved back to Iran, I was very much attracted to the English language books because I didn't want to forget my English. So I made an effort, a very concerted effort, to read those books. And my mom's books were all the classics. They were Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters. So when we were in the basement, I was literally reading British classics set in the 19th century for the most part. And those books really shaped me. At that time, we didn't have, or at least my mom didn't have, what we would call middle grade or young adult books. So that's what I was reading.
Thanks. Let's see. I wanted to ask a little bit about your research process and kind of the tools and sources you use to put yourself back in that world in 1953 and later in order to write the story.
Yeah, that's a great question. I did, so basically for the Stationery Shop, I had to educate myself about 1953 Iran. And there were many layers to that. On the one hand, there was the whole coup d'etat that happened, the history behind that, the politics behind that, the countries involved in that, because there were foreign countries involved too. So I immersed myself in nonfiction books about the coup, about the leaders at that time, and that was one layer of the research. But another layer, as many readers of historical fiction know, is you have to build the world of that time. And that means including things like, what were people wearing? What were they eating? What were they listening to? What kinds of movies were they watching? And I was very lucky because I had the opportunity to talk to my father a lot. And he was the one who helped me. So he'd give me details like the kinds of shoes the girls were wearing. He was very adamant that I get the pastries right. There was the elephant ear pastry. Those of you who've read the Stationery Shop know, which is really like a Madeleine, and a tongue-shaped pastry. And he told me the movies that they had watched at Cinema Metropole, real cinema in Tehran. So the character of Bahman, the hero of our story, matches in age exactly with my father. He's not my father by any means, but it was very convenient to have his age match my dad's, because that way, when Batman is 15, I know kind of what he'd be wearing. And when he's 17, I know what he'd be reading, realistically, what he'd be listening to, because I could just turn to my dad and mine his memories. The other thing I wanted to share with you all is that on the one hand, there's the research about the coup, and then there's the layers of research about what people were wearing and listening to and all of that. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of my own motivation for writing The Stationery Shop was so I could talk to my dad, because I was in a situation where if I normally call him, he'll just be like, oh, we're good, everything's great. We don't get into details about the past during a nightly phone conversation. But because I was writing this book, I had an excuse. I had an excuse to ask a lot of questions that I wanted to know about, and to, really, really get a sense of what life was like in the 50s in Iran when he was an adolescent and a young man. So that was another huge motivation for me for writing this book and setting it in the time I did.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So it was also kind of a tool for connection between
Yes,
you and your father.
yes, very much so.
Let's see. Melanie also asks, are you drawn to writing more historical fiction? Do you enjoy other genres?
What's really funny is I never set out to write historical fiction. So my first book, Together Tea, it's semi-autobiographical, right? So Together Tea is set in the late 1970s when the revolution happens, and right after, when the war begins in Iran. And also the other dual timeline is the 90s, where the main character's in her 20s in business school, wanting to be an artist and what have you. When this book was accepted for publication and someone mentioned it's considered historical fiction, I laughed. I laughed so hard, because I was like, what? The 90s and the late 70s are considered history? And I remember at the time, my editor's assistant, who was maybe 24, said, yeah. So yeah, so there you go. That was, I guess, my first foray, completely unintentional, into historical fiction. With The Stationery Shop, by then, weirdly enough, I was kind of known as, not that I was widely known, but those who knew me as a historical fiction writer. So this one was very intentionally historical fiction, set in 1953, which I get, that's history. Maybe my bias is whenever I'm not born is history, but anytime after, any year during my own lifetime couldn't possibly be history, but of course it is. And then now the third book that I've been working on is also very much considered historical fiction. Do I enjoy other genres? Absolutely. Yeah, I love contemporary fiction a lot. I would say I read that more than I do historical fiction. I read both. I read many, but yeah.
When you were saying that, it made me think, like, if early 90s music can be classic rock, I think
Yeah.
something set in the early 90s can probably also be historical fiction. Unfortunately, even though we don't think it can be.
I know. And by this point, the late 70s, definitely, right? That's just like accepted as history. But it's just funny how sometimes you fall into things, because I never set out to write historical fiction. Also, truthfully, I took so darn long to finish the book that it became historical fiction, because I started writing it in the 90s. And at the time it was contemporary.
I see. Cool. Hmm.
Yeah.
Let me ask another question about the book. Did you, as far as the kind of the arc that the characters take, did you have inspirations for that kind of whirlwind love story and kind of for people in that struggle of kind of moving on and not moving on?
I did. I think sometimes you can read like a quote or see a picture, and that can spark the whole novel for you. So, in addition to the gentleman whom I met at the assisted living center that I told you about, there was a quote I read, and it was from F. Scott Fitzgerald. They slipped briskly into an intimacy from which they never recovered. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh my God, that's basically the theme of this second book. This is before I'd written it. And so the character arcs for me very much followed that. I wanted Roya's entire development as a character to encompass one overarching truth, which she comes to realize at the end of the book. And I don't think it's giving anything away because I don't really spell it out in the book. I think it's more that the reader surmises this from her journey. And that is that Roya, as those of you who've read the book know, suffers a lot of loss in her life. But what I wanted for her character arc to be was for her to, at the end, close to the end of her life, to realize that love outlasts loss. And when she thinks of everything she's lost and everything she's gained, what she's gained outweighs what she's lost, in part because the past is always there. So I don't want to get too meta, but I think she comes to terms with the losses in her life by the end of the book. She achieves a level of not just acceptance but healing, and a lot of that healing has to do with how she's able to reconcile what happened with her first love. So just a funny anecdote, Eric, is that, when your manuscript goes to the editor, sometimes they make, big notes, sometimes they make little notes. A lot of the little notes made sense to me, I accepted. But there was one thing that I would not budge on, not that my editor for the Stationery Shop suggested it, thank God, because she got it, but somebody else had. They had suggested that I start the book when the characters are 17 and show them falling in love and then follow their story until they're 77. And I was like, absolutely not, no way. The book has to start when they're 77. It was really, really important to me that the book start so that you see as a reader that they have not been together for 60 years, because to me, this is a book about lost love, not so much first love. So that's an example of, there's so many things you can do as a writer to help with the arc of your character. And one of them is the order in which you present the tale. And rarely is the chronological order the best order for the reader, because usually a not chronological order creates the maximum emotional impact.
Sense, yeah. Melanie asks, can you talk more about how you develop your characters? Do you know what they look like? How far do you go?
I go so far that I think, sometimes the people I live with might think I'm going a bit too far. But I think you have to go really far to create believable characters. So remember when I showed you my notebook? I do a lot of character work in these notebooks. And the best way to really make your characters authentic is for you as the writer to know everything about them. It doesn't mean the reader should. They actually shouldn't. And it doesn't mean the character should. They shouldn't, but you, the author, should. So I do diary entries where, as I said, I write in the voice of the character. So I really understand it's not enough for me to know what happened to them. I need to know what's their biggest fear, what's their biggest regret, what do they eat for breakfast, who can't they stand the most. Some of this stuff may never end up in the book, but it's really, really important for me to know so I can develop the characters. As far as what they look like, yes, I know what they look like. Now, because I was brought up on those British classics, unlike those authors, I don't do a 3-page description of everybody's physical attributes because I was told not to. I kind of would if I could. But yeah, I know what they look like, and I give a little bit, I think, a lot of it. I think it's important for the reader to also know what they look like, but you leave space for the reader's imagination to fill in the blanks. It's kind of like method acting. Some actors like method acting. Some writers like to go real deep. The only tip I would have is if you are the kind of writer who ends up doing character journals and you don't want your family members to worry about you, really make it clear that it's a character journal. Because I was writing in the voice of my character, and then, you know, one of my kids was like, oh my God, mom's having an affair. It's like, no. I'm writing this, my character, it's not me. So, you know, yeah, I think the more you as a writer know about your character, the better.
Yeah, I'm glad that got sorted out with the.
I'm really glad that got sorted out. Yes. So I don't know if you can see on Zoom, but ever since that unfortunate incident, I have taken to using these labels very high tech so that, you know, it's clear. Like I should probably write like with huge letters, novel research, not my diary. Yeah.
Let me ask, during the process of developing and writing the book, were there any difficult choices or decisions that you just agonized over, and kind of how did you get those resolved?
Well, basically I wrote the first draft and I knew something was missing and I didn't know what. And then a friend of mine who hadn't even read the book, just hearing me talk about it, said, oh, I think you should. Again, I don't want to give spoilers, but let's just say one of the main characters ended up dying, who wasn't dead in my entire first draft. That was a difficult choice I had to make, Eric. I labored over it. I fussed over it. I was so worried about it because I didn't know if it would work for the story, but also because it would mean I would have to rewrite the whole darn second half of the book because he used to be in it. So anyway, that was an agonizing choice, but when I really thought it through, it made sense, and I knew it had to happen, and it would only strengthen the story. So after that first draft, I did it. I killed the character, and then I had to rewrite the second half because he was no longer alive to be in it. So yeah, those are the choices you have to make, and I think that's why we have drafts, because what happens in first draft can be very different than what happens in the ensuing drafts.
And just with talking about like putting your, kind of having the book take people back, have you been, since the book has come out, have you been like contacted by anyone who is alive at that time or who has memories or heard stories? And yeah, can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's the most magical thing. It's one thing to have people my own age read it. It's one thing to have younger people read it. That's always amazing. But some of the most moving responses have been from people who were there and who write to me and say, "You brought my city back. You brought my country back," because most of us know Iran has changed so much. So it's not the country that it was in 1953 by any means. It's changed so very much, more so than most countries because of the revolution and the cultural shifts. Those are very, very moving. I also get another genre of responses from people who say, "This for me brought back memories of my first love, and this for me helped heal issues that remained with my first either love or even friend." Sometimes friendships are like breakups, and that's very moving when people say, "Because of Roya's journey, I also felt a sense of healing," because when you're immersed in a novel, you sort of embody what the character's feeling and thinking. And so, yes, those are very, very moving responses. I also have another whole genre of people saying, "Because of this, I reconnected with my first love on Facebook, and I'm not responsible for any breakups of marriages or anything like that." Like sometimes those I read, I'm just like, "Oh, hope things worked out though," because, that could go either way.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, have you been back to Iran since you lived there? Can you tell us a little bit about
Um,
going
yeah, so
back?
I left when I was 10, almost 11, and then I didn't go back for 15 years. Then I went back when I was 25. Um, a, a lot like the character in Together Tea, because that part was kind of taken from my own trip. But then I went back 3 more times. I haven't been back since 2011. That's the last time I was there. So it's been a long time. But when my grandparents were alive, I had a lot more reason to go back because I was so much missing them and wanted to see them. But now that all four of my grandparents have passed, I don't have that personal desire, though of course there's the desire to see the country itself, and I still have relatives there, of course, that I want to see. But the main reason I kept going back was to see my grandparents.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. Is there anything um you would want people to know about like Persian or Iranian families?
Oh,
That
much.
is there anything you would like us to know that we don't know?
Mm, um, yeah. I think there's one thing that most people are a bit surprised by, because Iran's history, especially in the past century, the past 100 years, has been fraught with so many terrible leaders and governments and political repression. And because seriously horrible things do happen in Iran, I think people mistakenly think that the people of Iran are like serious or down, and they are, if they are down, they have every right to be. But I think people don't realize how lighthearted the Persian culture can be, how much joy there is in the Iranian culture, and how funny people are. That's something I think we sometimes may not know. So I think, yeah, it's a very lighthearted culture. Weirdly, don't ask me why, because all evidence would make them like cry all day if they have every right to, but they're very lighthearted. So that's something I think people don't know. But at the same time, there's this weird melancholia in the culture too. Lots of contradictions in the culture, like in many cultures.
So last, I think I'll ask about, you mentioned that you're working on something.
Mhm.
What can you tell us about your next project?
So this third book also takes place in Iran and in America, just like the first two books that I've written. I consider it like almost a trilogy, even though none of the books are related to one another. They just have that in common. It's a book I started back in 2019, and it's a friendship story. So it follows two girls who meet when they're 7 years old in 1950, and it follows their friendship for the ensuing 30 years and ends in the early 80s. And one of them is very politically active and ends up being a women's rights activist. So it's very much about women's rights.
Cool. Well, we'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's see. We have Melanie. Melanie wants you to know that she really enjoyed the talk and loved the book and purchased the stationery shop as gifts for friends and family.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you for being such a good participant tonight. Also, Melanie, I'm very appreciative, and I hope your friends and family enjoy it. Yeah, thank you, Eric. You've been great.
Yeah, thank you. If we don't have any more questions, I will go ahead and, speaking of thank yous, Marjan, I wanted to thank you for an inspiring and illuminating talk and for answering our questions. Thank you all in the audience for being here and asking good questions. I want to thank my colleague Gretel for recommending the book to me. I want to thank, yay. I want to thank the Estes Valley Library Friends and Foundation for supporting everything we do. Just a quick library announcement or two. Wanted to give folks a quick reminder about our summer reading program. For the remainder of this month, when you log your reading time in our app, those minutes will count toward a drawing at the end of the month. We'll be giving away some great prizes, including a set of Apple AirPods and gift certificates to local businesses. So see our website or talk to a library staff member for more information. And then finally, I will be emailing out a survey about this evening's program. So I'd very much appreciate it if folks would tell us what they thought. In that email, I'll also include links to any resources or programs I mentioned during the program. So thanks everyone again, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, take care, everyone.